Okay, I'd like to introduce Brad Lau, who is the president of the Honolulu Orchid Society. He will be talking about Fragrant Orchids, part 2. Thank you so much, Brad, for joining us.
I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. I did last year give another Fragrant Orchid presentation, so that's why I'm labeling this one part 2. Okay, so for those who were at the presentation last April, what do you remember? And I realize that not everyone was there, but for those who were there, what do you remember? Anyone? You can unmute.
That's a hono.
Right. This is a picture of a hono, but for those who were at my talk last April, what do you remember about the Fragrant Orchid talk?
There's a dormant period?
Yes, there's a dormant period. We're talking specifically, though, for dormant period for hono orchids, but in general, for the Fragrant Orchid talk, what do you remember?
I remember something about you could use the cane and regrow it.
Right. So you're remembering a lot from the hono talk, which was actually early in the spring of last year. But in addition to that, a little bit later on in April, I gave a Fragrant Orchid talk. Anyone else? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to recap a lot of what was covered in the Fragrant Orchid talk. And in addition, because hono orchids are in bloom right now and extremely popular, I'm going to actually go over quite a bit of the basics of hono orchid care, in addition to introducing you to a few more examples of fragrant orchids. So it builds on the part 1, but also recaps quite a bit. So in case you didn't attend the talk last year, you'll still get a lot of the good information. Okay, so what is fragrance? Scents begin as oils produced by the petals in flowers. These oils evaporate. They're volatile compounds. So in warm sunlight, bright light, they tend to disappear. They can linger with higher humidity or in still air, but in breezy air, they might not be as strong. Flowers can produce anywhere from less than 10 to over 100 chemicals for scent. People that are interested in perfumes realize this. Fragrant oils are determined by the genes of the actual plants. Why fragrance? It's all about pollination and reproduction. So that was the basic take-home message from my talk last year. These plants or these flowers are fragrant because they want to attract pollinators. The scent attracts these pollinators. The scent requires energy. So not every plant can produce a showy flower and also be fragrant. It may affect the flower life. Longer lasting, showier flowers like cattleyas may or may not have fragrance. And showy flowers tend to attract insects based on their color or pattern and don't necessarily have much fragrance at all. Scent as well as toxins may also deter insect pests. In addition, there are plant-to-plant communications that are going on. So scents that are volatile can send clues to inform other plants that they're ready for pollination. Scents emitted after pollination may reduce the attractiveness of pollinators to go to the already pollinated flowers. This is very interesting in that you wouldn't want a pollinator to spend much time on a flower that was already finished with its pollination, and we would rather send those insects to other unpollinated flowers. There's commercial importance. Scent itself is not necessarily a big selling factor. Longer lasting, showier flowers are important. Compact growth for easy shipping, that's important. And early flowering for the size of the plant. That is, when the plant is relatively young and smaller, will it flower so that the plant can be sold? Or do you have to wait 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 years before you can see flowers? This is an example of Cattleya walkeriana, which has a really nice smell to it. Usually blooms in the spring, and a very popular species, Cattleya. Pollination. 3/4 of all crops depend on insect pollinators. Honeybees alone pollinate 1/3 of all US crops. Pollinators add an estimated $217 billion to global economy. Pollinators support a healthy ecosystem, cleaning the air, stabilizing soils, and supporting wildlife. Pollinators include bees, wasps, birds, bats, butterflies, moths, beetles, flies, gnats. Just about all those flying insect type creatures can act as pollinators. And hummingbirds too. Bee pollinators, here's some pictures. Coryanthes orchid and euglossine bee, honeybee in the middle, and a bumblebee on the right. Most bee pollinators are solitary and highly efficient. Moths and butterflies can also be pollinators. Here are some pictures of Hawaiian moth on the left, painted lady butterfly in the middle, and a hummingbird moth on the right. I once was in my garden area and saw something fluttering, relatively big for an insect, and it was a hummingbird moth. So you can actually find these in Hawaii. Also, there's mimicry and deception and pheromones that are used for pollination. So on the left picture here, this is an orchis orchid, which resembles a bee. So the male bee comes by thinking it's going to mate, but it's actually an orchid. Orchis you can find actually in the Mediterranean area, Morocco and around the Mediterranean. Spider orchid is on the right. That's a picture of a wasp. And showy flowers may have no scent. So here's 2 good pictures of very colorful patterned slipper orchids. So these are Paphlopedium. Energy is directed towards the flower. The flower can be longer lasting. Flower size tends to be larger and attractive. And there isn't much scent. Although I did ask someone who knows quite a bit about orchids, and he said one of the very famous orchid nursery experienced growers said, in his opinion, all orchids have some sort of smell. We don't always appreciate that there is much, though. Or maybe our noses aren't really that sensitive. A sample of fragrant orchids includes scents that vary from good smelling to not so good smelling. Not all people can smell the same scent, so I often will give the same flowering plant that I can appreciate to my wife to appreciate, and she says she sometimes cannot take it in. Some scents are best during the day, during the bright light, or in the morning. Others are better at night. Some of the night flowers are going to be white and attract moths that come out at night. Many hybrids, though, have little to no scent. So here's a picture of this Bulbophyllum Makoyanum, which is like a daisy chain type orchid. When you look at it, it's kind of spiral shaped. And each of those little spirals is a separate orchid. So it's actually a cluster of about a dozen orchids in a little circle there. Fragrant Orchids Part 1 included, let's see, there's 13. So these 13 were discussed in the talk I gave last year. Of these, I'm going to just mention a little bit more, a little review for the 5 that I have here in black. The others, I'm not going to spend as much time on, but they're all really good examples of fragrant orchids. So the first one is Prosthecia or Encyclia. Prosthecia was part of Encyclia earlier, but got renamed by botanists, so I'm just including it with the Encyclia family. This example is Prosthecia radiata, which I grow. I mention it because of all the orchids I'll be talking about today, this one by far has the strongest smell that I can appreciate. It's found in tropical America. It has a strong coconut scent. It has very waxy, thick flowers, and that helps to make it last a lot longer. It's really not fussy about its requirements. I give it watering maybe 2-3 times a week, and medium bright sunlight, but not full sunlight. And it has new shoots every year, and it has flower spikes on old growth as well as new growth, and it's just really easy to grow. If you get a small plant, eventually that plant will keep growing and develop into a nice specimen plant. The second one is Oncidium in general. These have chocolate vanilla type scent, which is very popular. Blooms in the spring and the fall on new growth, and it has a long flower spike that arches over. They're relatively easy to grow, and when the plants get big enough, you can always divide them and have more plants. So in the upper right-hand corner is Oncidium Shari Baby, sweet fragrance that has a chocolate and vanilla smell, and it's usually stronger during the day. And this example on the middle bottom is Oncidium Twinkle, which has more of a spicy vanilla type smell to it. It's a miniature grower, miniature to medium-sized grower, and small flowers, which are white or pink in color. But there's many Oncidium that have quite a good smell to them. And there are also a lot of Oncidium that don't have any smell whatsoever. I'm going to mention this Catasetum hybrid, Fred Clarkeria After Dark. This is a picture of a plant that I grew. And besides having a spectacular pattern, spotted pattern to it, it has a very, very nice smell to it. This one happens to be a hybrid cross of several Catasetum type orchids and has a gingerbread type scent to it. The flower colors for this particular one can be anywhere from black to brown pattern with spots. And this one has actually very large leaves that will drop off in the late fall, and then the flower spike will come up after that. This is another example of a Catasetum. This was Catasetum dentigrianum, also a plant that I've grown. It grows from spring through the fall. You need to shade it from full sun because a broad leaf takes up a lot of sunlight, and in a shady area, that's enough light for it. If you gave it more full sunlight, it might be too much and burn the broad leaf. You can fertilize and water it from spring through the fall when the new roots in the spring are about 3 inches long. But before then, you actually don't really want to water or fertilize it at all until it gets to have a new growth that has the roots that are that long. It does need a winter rest. So actually right now I have about a dozen of these types of plants, and all of them I have not watered at all since December, and now it's March. And then if I look at my dozen or so plants, all but one have a new growth just beginning, which I'm going to continue to follow, and then hopefully they will get new roots. And when those new roots reach 3 inches long, then I can start watering and fertilizing. But until then, those plants will just be growing on the strength of their stored sugars that are in the thick bulb that is part of the plant. So actually all of those dozen plants have just a thick bulb and no leaf, and the new growth is just coming up from there. Maxillaria, I did mention last year. This is the Maxillaria tenuifolia or coconut orchid. On the top right is the yellow form, yellow flower form, and on the bottom right is the more common kind of maroon red form. These are from Mexico to Nicaragua. They have a coconut or pina colada type scent. They have thin grassy leaves that will tolerate quite a bit of sunlight. I have them outdoors in my landscape in little baskets and hanging from my trees, but they also grow in pots. And this morning I made about 10 or so new repottings of this, and I will be giving away those 10 plants at the end of my talk today. I'm going to mention about Honohono dendrobiums, which have a raspberry to strawberry scent. The example in the middle, the kind of pink one, or light lavender, is Dendrobium superbum, or also known as Dendrobium anosmum, little sweet scent. And the little sweet scent name is very appropriate because it has a very nice smell to it. And then this darker purple one on the right is Dendrobium nestor, and that is a cross between Dendrobium anosmum and Parishii. Dendrobium anosmum is the most common Honohono orchid that you'll find. And although all of those examples of regular Honohono orchids are Dendrobium anosmum, each one has a slightly different flower color. Some are white, some are pink, some are white with a purple lip to it, some are more lavender. There's all different types, and they're just examples of different varieties, even though they're all the same Dendrobium anosmum. In the case of Dendrobium nestor, this one on the bottom right, it's actually a cross between Dendrobium anosmum and Dendrobium Parishii, which is another species Dendrobium. Parishii is important because it tends to bloom later. And so when you have a cross like this, sometimes this Dendrobium nestor will tend to bloom later after most of the regular Honohonos have already bloomed. Okay, so here's some pictures of Honohono orchids. They're extremely popular, and the Honohono name came after the alternating leaf pattern that you'll see on these orchids, which resembles Honohono grass. And so that's where the name came from. After the flowers finish blooming, this will be like late March, early April. When the flowers are done, you can actually cut the canes off and put them on a tray and let new shoots grow, which is the picture on the middle left. You can see there's a new growth coming out and new roots coming out of that old cut cane. You don't want to leave the cane on the plant without cutting it off, because sometimes that might delay keikis from growing, and it also maybe slows down new keikis or new growths, new shoots to form in that plant that just finished blooming. So usually you want the energy all to go towards making new plants, not so much energy towards making the cane get keikis that are on there. Once the plant starts growing new shoots, then you want to fertilize regularly from the spring to the fall, give a winter month's rest, which I'll talk about a little bit more, and then it blooms again in the spring, usually around March of each year. Sometimes when the plants are growing too well, they may forget to go into blooming cycle, and then they will miss a year of blooming. But most times you can get them to bloom each year. This picture on the right is Dendrobium Neifert Sweet Lalani. Very nice fragrance, very large flowers, and brilliant color. So what I did was, the next few slides is a Honohono monthly care guide. And this is just to emphasize that the plant, these Honohono orchids, go through definite cycles, which are in certain months. So if we start with the dormant cycle, when the plant is in rest, this is in December. You want to decrease watering ahead of December, down to 2 times a week or so, let it dry out. There should be no fertilizing after Thanksgiving. And if there's any leftover pellet fertilizer in the pot, you can go ahead and shake that out, because you don't want things to stimulate growth. You want to stimulate rest. In January, leaves may turn yellow and fall off. Sometimes to help it along, some people do cut off the leaves if they're not turning yellow by themselves. But most of the time, if the plant is going into dormancy, it will lose its leaves. In February, small buds can begin to form. You need to be watching out for thrips, because thrips will attack the small buds. You can even treat for thrips by using alcohol or like a horticultural spray, and that will help to protect those buds so that they can grow bigger. And sometimes even new shoots may form at the base of the old canes. So even though there are buds going on those old canes, there are sometimes new shoots, new canes growing. In the flowering cycle, which is March through May, in March, buds will continue to grow and get bigger. They'll swell. Again, you want to protect them from thrips until they get big enough. It seems like the thrips really like the succulent new buds that are coming up. White flowers would tend to bloom earlier, late February, early March, followed by lavender and then the purples and other varieties. In April, be sure to keep water off of the flowers, because the water that's left on flowers can sometimes cause the flower color to be affected. You can water daily or nearly daily. You can separate the plants from each other so that there's good airflow around the plants. This helps the plants to cool off a little bit, as well as to decrease diseases like fungus or bacteria that might grow on the plants if the water doesn't all evaporate. And in May, different hybrids can bloom a little later, like I had mentioned with that other example that I gave. So March and April is the heavy blooming time for Honohono orchids, but we'll see some of the hybrids of Honohono orchids that will bloom in May and sometimes even early June. Planting cycle follows the flowering cycle in May, June, and July. In May, there are new shoots that come up, and sometimes keiki will grow on the cut canes that you have placed down on trays. You can begin to use half-strength liquid fertilizer about 1 or 2 times per month, and be sure to remove any canes that have already finished flowering from the pots they were in before. You can mark the canes with the name of the Honohono variety. That way you don't lose track of them. You can just put a little tag on them or separate them out into different areas, so that when keikis do form and you cut the canes up and replant those keikis, you will know which Honohono orchids you have, what colors they are. In June, put cut canes in the tray, like I mentioned. Keikis may grow. You can, whenever you cut things, cut old canes or cut keikis, then you need to be sure to disinfect your tools with heat or alcohol to prevent transmission of viruses. Viruses are common in orchids and especially common in Honohono orchids. So if you have a mature plant, odds are that mature Honohono plant has been exposed to virus and likely have virus. Whereas if you have a new keiki plant or new seedling, Honohono, a lot of those are virus-free, because seedlings are grown from seed and not prone to getting virus from the mother plant. In July, when keiki plants have new root growth of at least 1 to 2 inches, then you can put them into bark or sphagnum moss and let them grow on their own. It will take about 1 or 2 years before you see any flowers. Sometimes a new plant will have maybe 1 or 2 flowers, and then the following year there will be a new cane that's much longer, like a foot long, and then you have more flowers. And then the mature plants, usually about 3 to 5 years old, will be quite long, like 2 feet long, sometimes more. In the growing cycle, June through November, this is the most active growing period. This is the time when you really want to fertilize regularly and also water a lot. So in this upper right-hand picture, this is a photo from a really good grower, Calvin Kumano, that shows the small cane cuttings and new keiki growth. So each of these little green plants that are growing can form into a new Honohono orchid. And it just shows that by summer, a lot of the plants are growing. As these roots on these new keiki get to be 1 or 2 inches long, you can repot them. July through October, fertilize regularly, and you can even use weights on the ends of the canes to encourage them to grow downward. Otherwise, if the plant is on a hanger, it will oftentimes try to grow outward towards the light and be a little bit more horizontal or even a little bit more curled and not so much straight downward. Using the weights, like fishing weights, helps to get the cane to grow downward, but also be sure not to let anything touch the canes as they're growing downward, because if it does touch the ground or touch another plant, it will tend not to grow any further downward, but to try to aim upward or to go horizontally. In November, you want to be cutting back on water, cutting back or stopping fertilizer by the time the middle of the month to Thanksgiving occurs. This is just to force dormancy to get the plant to get into rest cycle in December. Okay, so I want to go on to Fragrant Orchids Part 2, a continuation, and we'll be talking about Cattleya trianae, which is a species Cattleya as an example. Cygnotches Wine Delight, which has a spice mint pepper-like fragrance. Vanda falcata, which has a jasmine vanilla-like fragrance. And Paracea elata. So the first one is Cattleya trianae, and it's called the Christmas orchid. It blooms in winter and through early spring. It's fragrant. It has a nice form to it. So it's nicely shaped, kind of a round, full, flat flower. Comes in many colors, from this lavender in the top right-hand corner to white to colors in between. It is a national flower of Colombia. It has 2 growths per year. One that grows in the early spring, finishes up by early summer, and another growth that comes up and then matures by late summer, which means it can have 2 flower spikes on it, each with maybe 2 flowers, so a total of 4 on a mature plant. I recently had this plant from around February. It's finished its blooming, but it was a very, very nice plant and relatively easy to grow as long as you keep up with its sun requirements. It doesn't take full sun, but it will tolerate a fair amount of bright filtered light. Second one is Cygnotches Wine Delight. It has a strong, spicy, sweet cherry type fragrance. It has waxy red flowers. I recently saw this one on sale at the Windward Orchid Society show in March. So it is available. Note the broad, wide leaves, thinner leaves. Whenever you see wider leaves, that plant usually needs a little bit less direct sun, a little bit more shade. This grows in the spring through the summer and has these large leaves will die back and fall off, leaving the plump pseudobulb or cane. And then you keep it dry during the winter, and the new growth comes out in the spring. But the important part is that it has a really nice smell to it. This is an example of Vanda falcata. It's also known as Neophonetia falcata or the samurai orchid. So it was told that historically samurai would get these plants and have the small flower and wear the flower on their uniforms. They are prized in Japan, and they're very, very serious about all the different varieties of flowers and colors, the leaves, the leaf shape, and so forth. They are fragrant, mildly fragrant. They're usually somewhat miniature in their growth, but they can also grow into a fair-sized medium plant. And the other thing about it is that it's really common to have a sphagnum moss ball, which you can see in some of these pictures, and put into a very, very nice looking small pot. So in Japan, the small pots can sometimes be $100 to $200, and the plant can be another $100 to $200. Note in the bottom left-hand corner, if you look very carefully, the leaves on that Vanda falcata are not only green, but green with a little bit of yellow edging. That's called variegated coloring. And so that is a very desirable color pattern for leaves. Also notice that on the back of the flower, there's a very long tube-like structure, and that's called a spur. So when you have a pollinator with a long tongue, that moth or butterfly can put its tongue into the spur and collect some of the treat, sweet treat, which is down inside of that spur. And then this last one, Peristeria elata, is called the dove orchid. So look in the picture on the right, and if you can imagine, right in the middle of that cup-shaped flower, there's a small dove looking straight at you. It has tall flower spikes that are sometimes 2 to 3 feet tall. There are multiple flowers that open sequentially. They're very waxy, so they tend to be long-lasting. They're called the Holy Ghost or dove orchid. And there's a large round pseudobulb, which is at the base of that flower spike. Sometimes the pseudobulbs can grow as big as the size of a baseball, and it's fragrant. Okay, so we want to go on and talk a little bit about shopping for fragrant orchids. You can search the internet just on the topic of fragrant orchids, and you can pull up a lot of suggestions. You can talk to orchid enthusiasts or vendors or nurseries, people that sell orchids at the farmer's market. You can smell it for yourself. So if you're ever at one of our orchid meetings or an orchid show and it's not too difficult, you can try to see if you can smell it for yourself. You can buy larger plants, but the cost might be a little bit higher. You can consider if it suits your own area. So if you live in a cooler, drier, or hotter, drier place like the Eva Plain, or you live in a place like Manoa or Nuuanu that's a little bit cooler, gets good airflow, maybe a little bit more moisture, those are all factors that could make it easier or more difficult to grow. And does it suit your watering style, which is, do you like to water plants a lot, or do you like to do other things and you're not trying to water them too often? Because each orchid has its own requirements. Okay, so searching for known favorites. Write down what you're interested in. If you find something, write it down, and that will help so that you can get the name right. Ask if it's a hybrid or species. So species orchids usually have a little bit more requirements for how much light, how much water, if there's a rest period, because species orchids are found in the wild. they're usually growing according to what the situation is in the wild. So let's take an example of a plant that grows in Southeast Asia and has a heavy monsoon season in June and July, and has a dry period in the winter months, December, January. If you give the plant too much watering in its normal natural dormancy period, the plant won't die, but it might also grow too much and skip its rest period and then not flower the following spring. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. Here's a picture of Brassavola nodosa, which was in my talk last year. It's an example of a fragrant, relatively easy to grow species orchid, which is hybridized with Cattleya to produce a lot of the very fragrant Cattleya hybrids that are available these days. But you can see from the bottom left-hand picture that it's quite a strong grower. This one is growing in the yard of one of our growers and like 30 inches wide. You can talk to others to learn more. You can go to Orchid Club meetings or events. You can talk to owners, to nurseries, to vendors at farmers markets, to friends and family or neighbors. Here's a picture of Matthias Silas. He owns and operates Shogun Orchid, Shogun Hawaii, which is a Cattleya orchid specialist, but he has other type of orchids as well. And this is an example of one of his prize-winning Cattleya hybrids, which is very large growing. This plant is probably about 7 or 8 years old with fantastic flowers. And you can smell it yourself. Not everyone can sense the smell. Time of day does affect how much you can smell. Develop an appreciation for the range of smells if you can, or even give yourself a chance to smell it and then pause a moment and smell it again. So I've read that sometimes the smell can actually change a bit from the time when you start to begin to appreciate it, and then give it a few minutes and smell it again. And then I've also heard from other people that some of the orchid smells are a little bit too strong for them, and they prefer something a little bit more subtle. So here's a picture of a species Phalaenopsis. It's Phalaenopsis violacea that has very nice color to it, but in addition has quite a bit of a very pleasant fragrance to it. Interestingly, most Phalaenopsis hybrids that you can buy these days have no fragrance that can easily be put, that you can appreciate. Their hybridizing or their growth is mostly for the commercial market, in that they're large, long-lasting, and eye-catching flowers, but they've been sort of bred out of that fragrance, whereas many Phalaenopsis species will have quite a bit of fragrance that you can appreciate. You can buy larger plants, which are healthier and might bloom more easily. They're easier to keep alive compared to small plants, because small plants can dry out. They can be divided because they're bigger plants. They're growing larger. You can divide them up, but they do cost more, and you always have to try to make sure that you're keeping up with them. So here's a picture of Dendrobium monospem, a hono type orchid called Purple Pride. Very, very nice blooming throughout the length of the cane. Each of these canes about 30 inches long, with flowers the whole way through. Does it suit your growing area? So as I stated before, microclimates do vary. Do you live in a place like a valley or a little bit higher up? In central Oahu, it might be a little bit cooler. In the leeward coast area, they might be a little bit hotter, drier, less rainy. So you have to kind of know your area. Another thing that's important is to appraise your watering habits. Do you like to water every morning? Is that something that you might not want to spend as much time doing? And basically with watering is you want to water at a time that will allow the plants to dry out. So if you're watering like at night and there's not enough time or drying or airflow to allow the water to evaporate and the water accumulates, sometimes you can get too much water that will promote fungal or bacterial growth in the crown of the plant. So a safer time to water would be earlier in the morning. And then if you see water is accumulating in the crown of the plant, like for a Phalaenopsis or Vanda, you can always tip the plant over and get some of that water out. Helping your fragrant orchids last longer. So here are some tips. So let's assume that you already have some nice plants and there's some fragrant flowers. You always want to keep your plants healthy, so be sure to water them and keep them in good shape, and that way the flowers will last longer. Keeping your plant cool with good air circulation is always good to keep the flowers fresher. Air-conditioned environment is really good, so air-conditioned offices are really good. Avoid pollinating insects. So if you have a plant which is just bloomed, you might want to take it into an area where insects can't get to it. Once the flower gets pollinated, the flower will lose its ability to stay fresh, and it will spend its energy growing into a seed pod. So that's very important. Watch for new buds that are just open so that you can try to separate them out a little bit, maybe get them to present a little bit better. Here's an example of a Cattleya species, Amethystoglossa, which needs a winter rest, but then comes out like this. It's a waxy, thick flower, so it's longer lasting. The scent is a little bit on the milder side. And then again, helping fragrant orchids last longer, avoid moisture on top of the flowers. So if you're watering the plant, don't get water on the flowers, get water on the roots. Keep flowers away from ripening fruits because they emit ethylene gas. Avoid direct sunlight. And then these are some of the orchid resources which are available to you. You can read about orchid care with online resources from American Orchid Society as well as Honolulu Orchid Society. So here's an Orchids magazine on the top right-hand corner. That's from American Orchid Society that comes out every month to members. You can talk to friends and family or neighbors. Neighbors are a really good source. If you look around in your area and you see that there are orchids that are growing really nicely, that means their microclimate supports that type of orchid. So that's something important to make note of. You can attend orchid meetings or shows and events. Always be looking out for that. And you can go to local orchid nurseries, although some are a little bit more restricted than before the pandemic, and always ask questions. So if you send me email about any of the questions, you can include pictures as well, and that will help us figure out what's going on. On the bottom right-hand corner is an example of our Honolulu Orchid Society website. So honoluluorchidsociety.org. And thank you for listening. Here's another example of Dendrobium Little Sweet Scent, a Honohono orchid that was at our April orchid display last year. Okay, so I do want to mention Honolulu Orchid Society meets every month on the second Wednesday night at 7 p.m. at Lanakila Elementary School cafeteria. And some of these photo credits were from Melvin Waki and Alan Nishioka, our photographers for Honolulu Orchid Society. Other ones that had no photo credit on it, I took myself.